Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Well, recently, Eric Carl Anderson and Sarah at Hardcover Hearts filmed a great discussion video called Top 5 English Novels. Although they didn't intend it to be a tag, the prompt definitely took off and spread across Booktube. And, of course, some of you clever booktubers changed things around. Matthew at Mayberry Books filmed a version called the Top 5 Un-English Books. And most recently, Steve Donahue has put out a top 5 books by guys named Mike, and then the slightly less probable, but even more charming, top 5 books by guys named Irving. I figured it was high time to have a video about the top 5 books by a woman named something. My first thought was to look at the names of my favorite authors. That would be Eudora Welty. I racked my brain and eventually realized that if I did a top 5 books by someone named Eudora, the list would just include my 5 favorite Welty novels. And then I thought about Flannery O'Connor. Could I come up with 5 Flannerys? Well, I realized to myself perhaps this would not be the game for me. But then I started thinking about the fact that it's Pride Month, and that perhaps I could put together a double duty list like top 5 lesbian novels or top 5 books of queer history or something like that. Last year for Pride Month, I talked about the traditional use of the color lavender instead of rainbow colors to symbolize lesbian identity, and sometimes queer identity more broadly. Since I'm an historian, I thought I would try to come up with something similar, some historical activism or reference to the gay community. And of course, the first thing that came to mind, the old phrase, friend of Dorothy. And immediately, I realized that I could combine these two perhaps disparate ideas and put together the top 5 books by authors named Dorothy. Let me talk first for a moment about the history of that phrase. Friends of Dorothy. Basically, during the mid-20th century, a gay man who was interested in another man but didn't know if he was receptive to a gay relationship could ask if the person was a friend of Dorothy. If the answer was, Dorothy who? Time to move on. But if he responded that he was very good friends with Dorothy, well, most people assume that the phrase was started in reference to Dorothy Gale, the protagonist of The Wizard of Oz, especially the movie. Fundamentally, it's the story of someone escaping the puritanical black and white world and creating a new family based on love for each other. Songs from the movie include Glinda the Good Witch singing come out, wherever you are," and of course Dorothy herself singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, imagery which is now tightly associated with the LGBTQ movement. The Cowardly Lion, one of the friends of Dorothy, is played in what I would say is a stereotype of a gay man. And then there's the preparation for the drag show. That's what that spa-like scene is, right? And the Technicolor skipping along the yellow brick road in sparkly high heels. Even Frank Baum's book includes some appropriate lines. When one character tells Dorothy Gale that she has some really queer friends, she replies that the queerness doesn't matter as long as they're friends. And that goes for straight people, gay people, and also those who go both ways, as the Scarecrow says. I don't doubt that this understanding of the phrase has great resonance now, at least for a lot of gay men. But there's a different and more literary explanation for that phrase as well. At least according to the speculations of a few historians, the original use of the phrase might have been in reference to Dorothy Parker, who quite publicly surrounded herself with gay male friends during the 1920s and 1930s. Supposedly, when Parker threw elaborate parties that served alcohol, at a time when alcohol was banned in the United States, the password that would allow entrance to the event was, "I'm a friend of Dorothy." So, the first of my 5 Dorothys is Dorothy Parker, the tremendously witty and sometimes even caustic author of short stories, essays, poetry, and criticism, who made a name for herself in the first half of the 20th century. I suppose I'd vote for reading your way through the portable Dorothy Parker that includes a wide selection of her work, including some much more serious work about labor, race, and even international politics. On to the second Dorothy, who was writing in New York at roughly the same time Dorothy Parker was, and that's Dorothy West. She's probably best known for her novels The Wedding and also The Living is Easy, about upper-class black families. Although she was raised in Boston, with a mother from my home state of South Carolina, West moved as an adult to Harlem, where she knew many stars in the Harlem Renaissance, including Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. I especially recommend the book The Wedding, which I think I've mentioned before on this channel. If you haven't read it, it's in some ways in conversation with Nella Larsen's Passing, although West's book is about intermarriage in a bourgeois African-American part of Martha's Vineyard, an area called the Oval. Sometimes people accuse her books of being a little bit too domestic, but I'm really drawn to her subtle analysis of themes of how upper-class identity intersects with the experiences of being a black woman. Okay, number 3 is another mid-20th century author, Dorothy Strachey, and her novel Olivia, about a 16-year-old student in a finishing school who falls in love with one of her teachers. This is a very short and intense book of both passionate longing and jealousy, not a gentle coming-out story. Given the fact that Dorothy Strachey was well known, the sister of Linton Strachey, and a member of the Bloomsbury Group, it surprises me a bit that I only discovered this book very recently. And interestingly, this is another book that sometimes feels in dialogue with Nella Larsen's Passing, although it deals with a very different context. Have any of you read it? The fourth of my 5 Dorothys is Dorothy Allison, who published the collection of short stories called Trash in 1988 and the novel Bastard Out of Carolina in 1992. I read them both when they first came out, and I think these were the first books of what I now think of as a new kind of Southern fiction by white authors. I was fairly widely read in classic Southern literature, including books written by white Southern women in the 1980s that seemed in many ways to be of a piece with that earlier writing. Dorothy Allison was quite a change, talking about sexual abuse in poor white communities and lesbian identity, etc. It seemed to be in dialogue not with Eudora Welty or, say, Josephine Humphreys, but instead with books like Alice Walker's The Color Purple and Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. I guess she's also sort of an intellectual and creative descendant of both William Faulkner and Carson McCullers. To be honest, I don't actually love the writing of Dorothy Allison, but she definitely opened my eyes to a broader vision of white Southern literature. Okay, on to my last choice for today. I hope all of you are thinking about all your own top 5 Dorothys, wondering how on earth I'm going to choose only one more here. There are a lot of good ones left. If you too are a friend of Dorothy's and want to leave your favorites in the comments or make your own video, please feel free. But I'm going to name for my final entry Dorothy Day. She was a journalist and radical activist in 20th century America who converted to Catholicism. She was imprisoned with the suffragist Alice Paul in the 1930s, established the Catholic worker movement, a pacifist movement that provided both political action in support of and direct aid to people living on the streets and living in poverty. I don't share Day's faith, and I don't accept all of her ideas about what she sees as moral action, but I'm utterly fascinated by the way she uses traditional Christian religion to make an argument for the necessity for socialist or communist ideas, as well as true pacifism. I first discovered Day when I was in college and learned about liberation theology. And I've always been intrigued by the way she accepts some traditional thoughts about gender and sexuality while also proposing a radical critique of the whole gender system. If you are new to her work, I'd recommend starting with the third volume of her autobiography called Long Loneliness. All right, thanks to Eric and Sarah for the video that started this whole vast subgenre of booktube videos. What fun. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.